I gave my daughter a small bakery so she could finally have something that was hers. 3 years of saving, 2 refinanced insurance policies, and every vacation day I hadn't taken in a decade. When I handed her the keys, she cried. I told her not to cry, that she'd earned this just by being who she was. 6 months later, I walked through that same door and found her on her hands and knees scrubbing the baseboards while her mother-in-law stood over her counting the morning's receipts like she owned the place. She did by then, almost. My name is not important. What matters is that I spent 32 years as a forensic accountant for the state of Tennessee. I have reviewed fraudulent financials for murder trials, divorce proceedings, bankruptcy cases, and corporate embezzlement schemes that made headlines. I know exactly what financial manipulation looks like. I know how it starts, how it hides, and how to unravel it thread by thread until the whole thing collapses. My daughter's mother-in-law had no idea who she was dealing with. Her name was Vivian. She was 64, recently widowed, sharp as a letter opener, and twice as dangerous. When my daughter Annette married her son 3 years ago, I thought Vivian was the kind of woman who was difficult but manageable. Strong opinions, strong personality, the kind of woman who always needs to be the most important person in the room. I'd known women like that my whole career. You learn to work around them. I was wrong about Vivian. She wasn't difficult. She was predatory. Here's what I knew when I walked in that morning. Annette had flour on her apron and tears on her cheeks and was on her knees in a commercial kitchen that I had paid for. Here's what I didn't know yet. The partnership agreement she'd signed 4 months earlier gave Vivian 51% controlling interest in Sweet Grounds, the bakery I'd bought my daughter with my retirement savings. Vivian was behind the register. She was wearing a blazer. In a bakery. At 8 in the morning. Dad, Annette said, and her voice cracked on the single syllable. I made myself smile. Just stopped by for coffee. That's all. Vivian looked up from the register with a smile that didn't reach anywhere near her eyes. What a wonderful surprise. We love having family visit, don't we, Annette? My daughter stood up, wiped her hands on her apron. Didn't answer. I ordered a coffee and a blueberry muffin. I sat at a table near the window and I watched. Annette's husband, Dustin, sat in the back corner with his laptop. He looked up once when I walked in, gave me a nod, and looked back down. He was 29 years old and had the spine of a wet newspaper. Vivian moved through the space like she'd built it herself, rearranging things, correcting Annette. Not harshly, not loudly, but constantly. A drip faucet of small corrections that would drive anyone insane over time. Not like that, sweetie. You need to wipe toward the door, not away from it. Did you remember to log the morning count? Because I don't see it on the sheet. I ate my muffin. It was excellent. Annette had always been a gifted baker. She'd been doing it since she was 9 years old, standing on a step stool in our kitchen, measuring flour into a ceramic bowl with more precision than most adults. When I finished, I left a 20 on the table and walked out. I drove home to my apartment in Brentwood, sat at my kitchen table, pulled out a yellow legal pad the same way I had for 32 years when the case started, and I wrote down everything I'd observed in 45 minutes. Vivian controls the register. Vivian corrects Annette's physical movements in her own workspace. Annette asked no one's permission to do anything. Annette looked ashamed when she saw me. Dustin did not intervene once. Then I wrote, "Find the partnership documents." That night, Annette showed up at my door, same as the old days, when she was 16 and had a problem she didn't know how to name yet. She sat at my kitchen table and I made decaf, and she stared at her hands for a long time before she started talking. She told me the whole thing. Vivian had offered to invest when Sweet Grounds was 3 weeks from opening, and a contractor had overrun the renovation budget by $18,000. I would have helped. I would have figured it out. But Annette hadn't wanted to ask me for more money. She said she felt guilty. I'd already given so much. So when Vivian appeared with the check and a partnership agreement that Dustin said was just standard legal language to protect everyone, Annette signed it. Page 1 looked fine. Page 4 was the problem. 51%. Vivian controlled all major business decisions, vendor contracts, staffing, hours, menu changes, everything that made Sweet Grounds what it was. Annette's vision, Annette's recipes, Annette's dream was now legally subordinate to a woman who thought a croissant was a fancy dinner roll. And Vivian's $18,000 investment, the one she'd framed as generous family support, she'd structured it as an interest-bearing loan to the LLC before the partnership was even signed. She'd get her money back plus interest before any profit split even started. I'd seen this exact structure in 3 separate fraud cases over my career, usually in the context of elder financial abuse, ironically. "Annette," I said when she finished, "look at me." She did. "I need you to get me copies of every document you have. The partnership agreement, the LLC formation papers, every email between you and Vivian about the business. Can you do that?" She nodded. "I'm not going to let her have this," I said. "Do you trust me?" She said yes, quietly but firmly. She left around 10. I sat alone in the kitchen and I opened the LLC filing records on the Tennessee Secretary of State's website, which are public record because that's how LLCs work in this state. Vivian had filed the LLC amendment adding her name as majority partner 6 days before the partnership conversation even happened. 6 days before she presented it to Annette as a spontaneous offer of help. Premeditation. Clear, documented, time-stamped premeditation. I pulled a fresh legal pad from the drawer. I've been retired for 14 months. I'd filled those months with woodworking projects and documentary series and long walks along the Harpeth River. It had been peaceful, but I'd also felt, in an honest moment I rarely admitted to anyone, a little purposeless, like a tool left in a drawer. That night, the tool came back out of the drawer. I started with the financial records Annette brought me the next morning. Vivian had been running every expense through the business account in a way that was technically legal, but designed to drain profit before it ever reached a distribution point. Coffee equipment lease payments to a company I didn't recognize, a monthly consulting fee, a bookkeeping service. I ran every company name through the Tennessee Secretary of State database. The equipment leasing company was registered to a Vivian M. Hargrove. The bookkeeping service was registered 6 weeks after the partnership signed, to the same address as Vivian's home. She was billing the bakery for services she was providing herself, skimming profit in plain sight. If you didn't know what you were looking at, it looked like normal business overhead. I knew exactly what I was looking at. I also knew that what I had was compelling evidence for a civil lawsuit, but not a slam dunk. Annette had signed the agreement. The LLC filings were technically legal. The self-dealing was clear to an expert, but required context to understand. I needed a lawyer who specialized in business fraud, and I needed to find out if there was more. I called my former colleague, a woman named Patricia. Not the Patricia you're thinking of. This is a former colleague who had been a forensic CPA for a large Nashville firm before she started her own practice. We had worked several cases together in the 90s. I trusted her judgment completely. She called me back in 20 minutes. "Tell me," she said. I told her. When I finished, there was a long pause. Then she said, "This isn't just fraud, you know. The loan structure combined with the self-dealing entities, if she did this deliberately from the start, this is theft by deception. Criminal exposure." "I know. You need a business attorney, not me, but I can help you document the financials in a way that's airtight for court. Send me everything you have." I did. 2 days later, I met with an attorney named Theodore Marsh, downtown Nashville, 3rd floor, glass office, understated. He reviewed what I'd compiled and didn't say anything for 4 minutes. I counted. Then he said, "Mr. Callahan, whoever put this together knew what they were doing." I said, "That's the problem." She did. He explained the situation clearly. The partnership agreement was signed and notarized. Challenging it required proving duress, misrepresentation, or fraud in the inducement. The LLC pre-filing was strong evidence of premeditation. The self-dealing financial entities were strong evidence of ongoing fraud. But we needed Vivian to confirm the intent. ideally in her own words. Tennessee is a one-party consent state for audio recording. If Annette was present in a conversation, she could record it legally. Can she do it? Theodore asked. She's been living under this woman's thumb for 6 months, I said. She'd crawl over glass to do it. I'll need the recording, plus the financial documentation. That gives us a fraud case worth filing. I called Annette that night, explained what I needed, explained why, explained that she didn't have to do it if it felt dangerous. She said, "Dad, she made me scrub the mop sink with a toothbrush last Tuesday because she said I hadn't done it properly the first time. I'll do it." Here's the thing about Vivian. She was smart, but she was also arrogant, and arrogance is the enemy of caution. She believed she had structured everything perfectly. She believed Annette was too passive and too grateful to ever fight back. She believed I was a retired old man who did woodworking projects and went to bed at 9. None of those things were fully accurate. Annette wore a small digital recorder, the kind you can order for $40 online and clip to a lanyard under your apron, for 6 days before she got what we needed. It happened on a Thursday afternoon. The bakery was slow. Dustin had left for a meeting. Annette approached Vivian at the register. She said, "I've been thinking about the partnership, about what happens long term. Will this ever really feel like mine again the way my dad meant it to be?" Vivian didn't look up from the register. She said, "Honey, it was never yours. Your father bought you a building and some equipment. I built this into a business." Annette kept her voice level. "But legally I still own 49%. Vivian finally looked up, smiled. "The papers you signed last spring go further than the partnership agreement. Dustin had you sign a transfer amendment with the quarterly filing. You own 8%. I own the rest. By the time your father figures it out, the annual filing will have processed and it'll be permanent. 8%. She'd taken Annette from 49% down to 8% without telling her. Over multiple documents spread across months. Dustin had helped. Annette said nothing. The recording ran for another 40 seconds of silence. Then Vivian added, "If you work hard, there's always a place for you here as an employee." I mean that genuinely. The recording was clear. Theodore listened to it once and said, "File date." We filed Patterson v. H. Hargrove in Chancery Court the following week. Fraud in the inducement, fraudulent transfer, breach of fiduciary duty, self-dealing. Theodore also sent a separate referral to the Davidson County District Attorney's Office with the financial documentation. Patricia had prepared an exhibit package that laid out the self-dealing entities with the clarity of a textbook example. That's when things escalated. Vivian called me at 7 in the morning, 3 days after the suit was filed. Her voice was composed, but the composure cost her something. I could hear it. "Robert," she said, "I think we need to talk. Just the two of us." I said, "Everything between us goes through my attorney." She shifted. "This can be handled quietly. You don't want this to go to trial. A lone public lawsuit is going to cost you more than you recover." "Vivian," I said, "I spent 32 years reviewing financial fraud for the state of Tennessee. I have prepared exhibits that have been used in criminal proceedings. My colleague has already delivered documentation to Davidson County that's outside the scope of our civil case. If I were you, I'd call Theodore Marsh's office and ask about settlement terms." Silence. "You think you're protecting her," Vivian finally said. "But Annette was never going to make this work on her own. I saved this bakery." I said, "You stole this bakery. There's a difference." Then I hung up. She called back twice. I let it go to voicemail. That same afternoon, Dustin showed up at Annette's apartment. She'd moved out 2 weeks earlier and was staying with a friend from her church. He stood in the hallway and said he could explain everything, that his mother had pressured him, that he'd had no choice. Annette told him she'd talked to him through her divorce attorney. She'd already retained one. I didn't even know she'd done it until she told me afterward. She handled it herself. I was proud of her in a way I didn't have words for. 3 weeks after filing, Vivian's first attorney withdrew. Her second lasted 10 days before citing irreconcilable communication issues, which is lawyer language for the client won't listen and the evidence is bad. Her third took a settlement meeting with Theodore, reviewed the recording and the financial documents, and advised Vivian to consider her exposure carefully. I sat in Theodore's conference room across from Vivian for 45 minutes. It was the first time I'd seen her since I'd stood in sweet grounds watching her correct my daughter's cleaning technique. She sat very straight, and she looked at the table, and she did not look at me once. Her attorney presented a settlement offer. Vivian would relinquish all ownership interest in Sweet Grounds. She would repay $18,000 in extracted business profit through the shell entities. She would pay Annette's legal fees. In exchange, we would not pursue criminal referral escalation. Theodore looked at me. I looked at the offer. Here's the thing about settlements. Theodore had told me early on that going to trial was a gamble for both sides. We had a strong case, but cases take time, and time costs money, and Annette needed her bakery back now, not in 18 months. We counteroffered. The repayment went to $24,000 to account for the interest Vivian had charged on her own loan. We added a 5-year non-compete barring Vivian from any financial interest in a food service business in Davidson County. We kept the criminal referral in play. That was the DA's decision, not ours, and we weren't withdrawing the documentation we'd submitted. Vivian's attorney stepped out, came back. Vivian signed. The criminal side moved more slowly, the way criminal things do. The DA's office called Theodore 4 months later. They'd reviewed the financial documentation and the recording. They were declining to prosecute on the fraud charges due to the civil resolution, but were moving forward on a separate charge related to the fraudulent filing of the LLC amendment, which was a Class D felony in Tennessee. Vivian was given the opportunity to plead to a lesser charge in exchange for 2 years of supervised probation and restitution. She took it. I found out the same day Annette called me from Sweet Grounds, laughing and crying at the same time, because the Nashville Food Scene group on Facebook had shared a post about her reopening and 200 people had responded before noon. The morning Sweet Grounds reopened fully under Annette's name alone was a Tuesday in March. I drove up at 6:30 while she was still setting up. The door was unlocked. I walked into the smell of brown butter and cardamom and coffee. She was behind the counter arranging pastries in the case, hair pinned up, apron on, flour on her left cheek. She didn't see me come in. She was humming. I stood in the doorway for a moment before she turned around. When she did, she stopped humming, and she just looked at me and neither of us said anything. Then I said, "Blueberry muffin, please. And coffee, black." She laughed. She made my coffee. I sat at my usual table near the window. The line started forming outside around 7:15. By 8, there wasn't an empty seat. Someone brought flowers. Someone brought a handmade sign. A woman I didn't know came in, squeezed Annette's hand, and said, "My daughter and I drove from Franklin because of your story. We wanted to be here today." By noon, Annette had sold out of everything in the case. She'd never sold out before. Vivian had always insisted on limiting production to control costs. Control, I realized, had been the whole point. The money mattered, but the control mattered more. I left around 1 o'clock. Annette walked me to the door. She looked exhausted in the way that good exhaustion feels, the kind that comes from a long day of exactly the right work. "Dad," she said. "I know," I said. She hugged me in the doorway. I could smell cardamom and coffee in her hair. Was it worth it? All of it? I thought about what I had spent. Annette's initial investment for me was gone, recovered partially through the settlement, but not fully. I'd paid Theodore Marsh more than I wanted to count. I was 63 years old and my savings were lighter than I'd planned. "Yes," I said. I drove home through Nashville traffic and I thought about Vivian, somewhere in the city, living with the consequences of what she'd done. I didn't feel triumphant about it. I mostly felt tired, but it was the good kind of tired, the kind that comes after something is finished. 3 months after reopening, Sweet Grounds was in the black for the first time since the partnership began. Annette hired 2 part-time employees, both young women she'd trained herself. She expanded the menu. She added a small loyalty program. She started teaching a Saturday morning baking class for kids. Dustin's child support payments arrived on time. No notes, just deposits. She didn't acknowledge them and he didn't contact her. The divorce was finalized on a rainy Wednesday in October. Annette texted me a single period when it was done. I texted back a single period. That was enough. I still go in most mornings. Black coffee, whatever's fresh from the case. I sit by the window with my phone or sometimes just watch the room. Annette moves through the space with an ease she didn't have before, not the stiff, careful ease of someone trying to avoid conflict, but the loose, comfortable ease of someone who's exactly where they're supposed to be. Faye, her daughter from her first marriage, comes in after school on Thursdays and does her homework at the corner table. She's 8 years old and already asked to help when Annette is decorating cakes. People ask me sometimes how I knew what to do. The truth is I didn't always know. There were nights I poured a second drink and questioned everything. There were nights I wondered if I was making it worse, if I should have just hired a lawyer from the start and stayed out of the emotional pieces. Wondered if I had any right to be as angry as I was. Then I'd think about Annette on her knees scrubbing a baseboard in her own kitchen, and the anger would clarify again, clean and useful, and I'd know exactly why. You can do a lot of damage to someone slowly, carefully, over time. Small corrections, small humiliations, paper by paper until they don't recognize what they signed or what they own or what's left of themselves. That's what Vivian was doing. That's what I'd watched happen in 32 years of financial fraud cases. Usually I was called in after the damage was done, when someone was already hollowed out. This time I got there in the middle. This time I could do something about it. So I did. The bakery's still there on 12th Avenue South. Yellow awning, the name Sweet Grounds in hand-painted letters that Annette designed herself. On a good Saturday morning, the line goes out the door and down the sidewalk. My daughter is behind the counter, doing exactly what she was always meant to do. That's the victory. Not the settlement, not the court documents, not Vivian's probation, just this. My daughter in her own kitchen, on her feet, in her own space, humming something I can't quite make out from the window table. That's all I was ever trying to get back for her. If you enjoyed this story, please like this video and subscribe to the channel. Leave a comment and tell me what time it is where you are right now. And if you want to hear the next story, it's waiting for you in the box on the left. I've thought about this a lot in the months since everything was resolved. Not obsessively, not in the way that keeps you up at night, but in the quiet way you turn something over when you're driving alone or sitting with a cold cup of coffee on a Sunday morning, trying to understand what actually happened. Not just the legal pieces, not just who did what and when. The deeper thing underneath it. Here's what I keep coming back to. Vivian didn't wake up one day and decide to be a predator. She made a series of choices, each one small enough to feel justified in the moment, and each one making the next one easier. First, she offered money. Then she drafted paperwork that favored herself. Then she filed an amendment without telling anyone. Then she set up shell companies to skim profit. None of those steps felt like crossing a line to her, I think, because she'd already moved the line. That's how it works. You don't leap over a cliff. You take one step at a time until you look back and can't see where you started. The same thing happened to Annette, just in reverse. Vivian didn't humiliate my daughter all at once. She did it one small correction at a time, one redirect, one patronizing comment in front of a customer, one document Dustin said was routine. By the time Annette understood what had happened, she'd been conditioned to doubt her own judgment. That's not weakness. That's what sustained, deliberate manipulation does to a person. I've seen it in financial fraud cases. I've seen it in family court documentation. It's a recognizable pattern, and it works because the person on the receiving end is usually decent enough to keep giving the benefit of the doubt long past the point they should have stopped. What I want to say, because I mean it, and not as a lesson but as something I actually believe from experience, is that expertise is not just a job skill, it is a form of protection. 32 years of forensic accounting meant I could look at Vivian's LLC filings and see the premeditation in the timestamps. I could look at her vendor contracts and see the self-dealing in the entity names. If I had been anyone else, if I had been a retired teacher or a retired contractor or someone who simply didn't know what those documents meant, I might have looked at the same papers and seen nothing wrong. Most people don't have that. Most people sign what they're told is routine because they trust the person handing them the pen. That's not stupidity. That's good faith. And good faith is what people like Vivian count on. So if there's anything I'd want someone to take from this, it's that you have the right to understand what you sign. You have the right to take documents to an independent attorney before you put your name on anything that involves your business, your property, or your financial future. That right doesn't disappear because someone is family. It doesn't disappear because someone makes it feel awkward to ask questions. Asking questions is not an insult. It is the most basic form of protecting yourself. Annette is doing that now. Every contract that comes into Sweetgrounds goes to Theodore Marsh before she signs it. She laughs about it sometimes, calls it her new policy. I told her it's not a new policy. It's just overdue. The choices we make when we think no one is watching are the ones that define us most accurately. Vivian made hers. They caught up with her the way they always do, not because of anything mystical or fated, but because evidence is patient, and the truth has a way of becoming visible when someone is paying attention. I was paying attention. That's all.